Chapter 16. Marianne would have thought herself very inexcusable had she been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would not have been ashamed to look her family in the face the next morning, had she not risen from her bed in more need of repose than when she lay down in it. But the feelings which made such composure disgrace left her in no danger of incurring it. She was awake the whole night, and she wept the greatest part of it. She got up with a headache, was unable to walk, and unwilling to take any nourishment, giving pain every moment to her mother and sisters, and forbidding all attempt at consolation from either. Her sensibility was potent, though. When breakfast was over, she walked out by herself, and wandered about the village of Allenham, indulging the recollection of past enjoyment, and crying over the present reverse for the chief of the morning. The evening passed off in the equal indulgence of feeling. She played over every favorite song that she had been used to play to Willoughby, every air in which their voices had been oftenest joined, and sat at the instrument gazing on every line of music that he had written out for her, till her heart was so heavy that no farther sadness could be granted, and this nourishment of grief was every day applied. She spent whole hours at the pianoforte, alternately singing and crying, her voice often totally suspended by her tears. In books, too, as well as in music, she courted the misery which a contrast between the past and present was certain of giving. She read nothing but what they had been used to read together. Such violence of affliction, indeed, could not be supported forever. It sunk within a few days into a calmer melancholy, but these employments to which she daily recurred, her solitary walks and silent meditations, still produced occasional effusions of sorrow as lively as ever. No letter from Willoughby came, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again became uneasy, but Mrs. Dashwood could find explanations whenever she wanted them, which at least satisfied herself. "Remember, Eleanor," said she, "how very often Sir John fetches our letters himself from the post, and carries them to it. We have already agreed that secrecy may be necessary, and we must acknowledge that it could not be maintained if their correspondence were to pass through Sir John's hands." Eleanor could not deny the truth of this, and she tried to find it in a motive sufficient for their silence. But there was one method so direct, so simple, in her opinion so eligible of knowing the real state of the affair, and of instantly removing all mystery, that she could not help suggesting it to her mother. "Why do you not ask Marianne at once," said she, "whether she is or she is not engaged to Willoughby? From you, her mother, and so kind, so indulgent a mother, the question could not give offence. It would be the natural result of your affection for her. She used to be all unreserve, and to you more especially." "I would not ask such a question for the world. Supposing it possible that they are not engaged, what distress would not such an inquiry inflict? At any rate, it would be most ungenerous. I should never deserve her confidence again after forcing from her a confession of what is meant at present to be unacknowledged to anyone. I know Marianne's heart. I know that she dearly loves me, and that I shall not be the last to whom the affair is made known, when circumstances make the revealment of it eligible. I hope no attempt to force the confidence of anyone, of a child, must less, because a sense of duty would prevent the denial which her wishes might direct." Eleanor thought this generosity overstrained, considering her sister's youth, and urged the matter farther, but in vain. Common sense, common care, common prudence were all sunk in Mrs. Dashwood's romantic delicacy. It was several days before Willoughby's name was mentioned before Marianne by any of her family. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, indeed, were not so nice. Their witticisms added pain to many a painful hour, But one evening, Mrs. Dashwood, accidentally taking up a volume of Shakespeare, exclaimed, "We have never finished Hamlet, Marianne. Our dear Willoughby went away before we could get through it. We'll put it by that when he comes again. But it may be months, perhaps, before that happens." "Months!" cried Marianne with strong surprise. "No, nor many weeks." Mrs. Dashwood was sorry for what she had said, but it gave Elinor pleasure as it produced a reply from Marianne, so expressive of confidence in Willoughby and knowledge of his intentions. One morning, about a week after his leaving the country, Marianne was prevailed on to join her sisters in their usual walk, instead of wandering away by herself. Hitherto she had carefully avoided every companion in her rambles. If her sisters intended to walk on the downs, she directly stole away toward the lanes. If they talked of the valley, she was as speedy in climbing the hills, and could never be heard of when the others set off. But at length she was secured by the exertions of Elinor, who greatly disapproved such continual seclusion. They walked along the road through the valley, and chiefly in silence, for Marianne's mind could not be controlled, and Elinor, satisfied with gaining one point, would not then attempt more. Beyond the entrance of the valley, where the country, though still rich, was less wild and more open, a long stretch of the road, which they had travelled on first coming to Barton, lay before them, and on reaching that point they stopped to look around them and examine a prospect which formed the distance of their view from the cottage, from a spot which they had never happened to reach in any of their walks before. Amongst the objects in the scene they soon discovered an animated one. It was a man on horseback riding towards him. In a few minutes they could distinguish him to be a gentleman, and in a moment afterwards Marianne rapturously exclaimed, "It is he! It is he indeed! I know it is!" and was hastening to meet him when Elinor cried out, "Indeed, Marianne, I think you are mistaken. It is not Willoughby. The person is not tall enough to be him, and has not his air." "He has! He has!" cried Marianne. "I'm sure he has. His air, his coat, his horse. I knew how soon he would come." She walked eagerly on as she spoke, and Elinor, to screen Marianne from particularity, as she felt almost certain of its not being Willoughby, quickened her pace and kept up with her. They were soon within 30 yards of the gentleman. Marianne looked again. Her heart sank within her, and abruptly turning round, she was hurrying back when the voices of both her sisters were raised to detain her. A third, almost as well known as Willoughby's, joined them in begging her to stop, and she turned round with surprise to see and welcome Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, the only one who could have gained a smile from her. But she dispersed her tears to smile on him, and her sister's happiness forgot for a time her own disappointment. He dismounted, and giving his horse to his servant, walked back with them to Barton, whither he was purposely coming to visit them. He was welcomed by them all with great cordiality, but especially by Marianne, who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than even Elinor herself. To Marianne, indeed, the meeting between Edward and her sister was but a continuation of that unaccountable coldness which he had often observed in Norland in their mutual behavior. On Edward's side, more particularly, there was a deficiency of all that a lover ought to look and say on such an occasion. He was confused, seemed scarcely sensible of pleasure in seeing them, looked neither rapturous nor gay, said little but what was forced from him by questions, and distinguished Elinor by no mark of affection. Marianne saw and listened with increasing surprise. She began almost to feel like a dislike of Edward, and it ended, as every feeling must end with her, by carrying back her thoughts to Willoughby, whose manners formed a contrast sufficiently striking to those of his brother-elect. After a short silence which succeeded the first surprise and inquiries of the meeting, Marianne asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been to Devonshire a fortnight. A fortnight? She repeated, surprised at his being so long in the same country with Eleanor without seeing her before. He looked rather distressed as he added, and that he had been staying with some friends near Plymouth. "Have you been lately in Sussex?" said Eleanor. "I was at Norland about a month ago." "And how dear does Norland look?" cried Marianne. "Dear, dear Norland," said Eleanor. Probably looking much as it always does this time of year. The woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves." "Oh," cried Marianne, "with what transporting sensation have I formerly seen them fall! How have I delighted as I walked to see them driven in showers about me by the wind! What feelings have they, the season, and are altogether inspired! Now there is no one to regard them. They are seen only as a nuisance, swept hastily off. "It is not everyone," said Eleanor, "who has your passion for dead leaves." "No, my feelings are often not shared, not often understood. But sometimes they are." As she said this, she sunk into reverie for a few moments, but rousing herself again, "Now, Edward," said she, calling his attention to the prospect, "here is Barton Valley. Look up to it, and be tranquil if you can. Look at those hills. Did you ever see their equals? To the left is Barton Park. Amongst those woods and plantations you may see the end of the house. And here, beneath that farthest hill which rises with such grandeur, is our cottage." "It is a beautiful country," he replied. "But these bottoms must be dirty in water. How can you think of dirt with such objects before you?" "Because," replied he, smiling, "among the rest of the objects before me I see a very dirty lane." "How strange," said Marianne to herself as she walked on. "I've an agreeable neighborhood there. Are the Middletons pleasant people?" "No, not at all," answered Marianne. "We could not be more unfortunately situated." "Marianne," cried her sister, "how can you say so? How can you be so unjust? They are a very respectable family. Mr. Ferrars, and toward us have behaved in the friendliest manner. Have you forgot, Marianne, how many pleasant days we have owed to them?" "No," said Marianne in a low voice, "nor how many painful moments." Eleanor took no notice of this, and, directing her attention to their visitor, endeavored to support something like discourse with him by talking of their present residence, its conveniences, etc., extorting from him occasional questions and remarks. His coldness and reserve mortified her severely. She was vexed and half angry, but resolving to regulate her behavior to him by the past rather than the present, she avoided every appearance of resentment or displeasure, and treated him as she thought he ought to be treated from the family connection. Chapter 17. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised only for a moment at seeing him, for his coming to Barton was, in her opinion, of all things the most natural. Her joy and expression of regard long outlived her wonder. He received the kindest welcome from her, and shyness, coldness, reserve could not stand against such a reception. They had begun to fail him before he entered the house, and they were quite overcome by the captivating manners of Mrs. Dashwood. Indeed, a man could not very well be in love with either of her daughters without extending the passion to her, and Eleanor had the satisfaction of seeing him soon become more like himself. His affection seemed to reanimate towards them all, and his interest in their welfare again became perceptible. He was not in spirits, however. He praised their house, admired its prospect, was attentive and kind, but still he was not in spirits. The whole family perceived it, and Mrs. Dashwood, attributing it to some want of liberality in his mother, sat down to table indignant against all selfish parents. "What are Mrs. Ferrars's views for you at present, Edward?" said she, when dinner was over and they had drawn round the fire. "Are you still to be a great orator in spite of yourself?" "No. I hope my mother is now convinced that I have no more talents than inclination for a public life." "But how is your fame to be established? For famous you must be to satisfy all your family, and with no inclination for expense, no affection for strangers, no profession, and no assurance, you may find it a difficult matter." "I shall not attempt it. I have no wish to be distinguished, and have every reason to hope I never shall. Thank heaven, I cannot be forced into genius and eloquence." "You have no ambition, I well know. Your wishes are all moderate." "As moderate as those of the rest of the world, I believe. I wish, as well as everybody else, to be perfectly happy, but like everybody else, it must be in my own way. Greatness will not make me so." "Strange that it would," cried Marianne. "What have wealth or grandeur to do with happiness?" "Grandeur has but little," said Eleanor, "but wealth has much to do with it." "Eleanor, for shame!" said Marianne. "Money can only give happiness when there is nothing else to give it. Beyond a competence, it can afford no real satisfaction, as far as mere self is concerned." "Perhaps," said Eleanor, smiling, "we may come to the same point. Your competence and my wealth are very much alike, I dare say, and without them, as the world goes now, we shall both agree that every kind of external comfort must be wanting. Your ideas are only more noble than mine. Come, what is your competence?" "About 1,800 or 2,000 a year, not more than that." Eleanor laughed. 2,000 a year? One is my wealth. I guessed how it would end. "And yet 2,000 a year is a very moderate income," said Marianne. "A family cannot well be maintained on a smaller. I am sure I am not extravagant in my demands. A proper establishment of servants, a carriage, perhaps two, and hunters cannot be supported on less." Eleanor smiled again to hear his sister describing so accurately their future expenses at Combe Magna. "Hunters," repeated Edward. "But why must you have hunters? Everybody does not hunt." Marianne colored as she replied, "But most people do." "I wish," said Margaret, striking out a novel thought, "that somebody would give us all a large fortune apiece." "Oh, that they would!" cried Marianne, her eyes sparkling with animation, and her cheeks glowing with the delight of such imaginary happiness. "We are all unanimous in that wish, I suppose," said Eleanor, "in spite of the insufficiency of wealth." "Oh, dear!" cried Margaret, "how happy I should be! I wonder what I should do with it." Marianne looked as if she had no doubt on that point. "I should be puzzled to spend so large a fortune myself," said Mrs. Dashwood, "if my children were all to be rich without my help." "You must begin your improvements on this house," observed Eleanor, "and your difficulties will soon vanish." "What magnificent orders would travel from this family to London," said Edward, "in such an event. What a happy day for booksellers, music sellers, and print shops. You, Miss Dashwood, would give a general commission for every new print of merit to be sent you. And as for Marianne, I know her greatness of soul. There would not be music enough in London to content her, and books, Thomson, Cowper, Scott, she would buy them all over and over again. She would buy up every copy, I believe, to prevent their falling into unworthy hands. And she would have every book that tells her how to admire an old twisted tree. Should not you, Marianne? Forgive me if I'm very saucy, but I was willing to show you that I had not forgot our old disputes." I love to be reminded of the past, Edward, whether it be melancholy or gay. I love to recall it, and you will never offend me by talking of former times. You're very right in supposing how my money would be spent, some of it at least. My loose cash would certainly be employed in improving my collection of music and books, and the bulk of your fortune would be laid out in annuities on the authors or their heirs. No, Edward, I should have something else to do with it. Perhaps then you would bestow it as a reward on that person who wrote the ablest defense of your favorite maxim, that no one can ever be in love more than once in their life. Your opinion on that point is unchanged, I presume. Undoubtedly. At my time of life, opinions are tolerably fixed. It's not likely that I should now see or hear anything to change them. Marianne is as steadfast as ever, you see, said Eleanor. She is not at all altered. She has only grown a little more grave than she was. Nay, Edward, said Marianne, you need not reproach me. You are not very gay yourself. Why should you think so? Replied he, with a sigh. But gaiety never was a part of my character. Nor do I think it's a part of Marianne's, said Eleanor. I should hardly call her a lively girl. She is very earnest, very eager in all she does, sometimes talks a great deal, and always with animation, but she is not often really merry. I believe you're right, he replied, and yet I've always set her down as a lively girl. I have frequently detected myself in such kind of mistakes, said Eleanor, in a total misapprehension of character in some point or other, fancying people so much more gay or grave, or ingenious or stupid than they really are, and I can hardly tell why or in what the deception originated. Sometimes one is guided by what they say of themselves, and very frequently by what other people say of them, without giving oneself time to deliberate and judge. But I thought it was right, Eleanor, said Marianne, to be guided wholly by the opinion of other people. I thought our judgments were given us merely to be subservient to those of neighbors. This has always been your doctrine, I'm sure. No, Marianne, never. My doctrine has never aimed at the subjection of the understanding. All I have ever attempted to influence has been the behavior. You must not confound my meaning. I am guilty, I confess, of having often wished you to treat our acquaintance in general with greater attention. But when have I advised you to adopt their sentiments, or to conform to their judgment in serious matters? You have not been able then to bring your sister over to your plan of general civility, said Edward Eleanor. Do you gain no ground? Quite the contrary, replied Eleanor, looking expressively at Marianne. My judgment, he returned, is all on your side of the question, but I'm afraid my practice is much more on your sister's. I never wish to offend, but I am so foolishly shy that I often seem negligent when I am only kept back by my natural awkwardness. I have frequently thought that I must have been intended by nature to be fond of low company. I am so little at my ease among strangers of gentility. Marianne has not shyness to excuse any inattention of hers, said Eleanor. She knows her own worth too well for false shame, replied Edward. Shyness is only the effect of a sense of inferiority in some way or other. If I could only persuade myself that my manners were perfectly easy and graceful, I should not be shy. But you would still be reserved, said Marianne, and that is worse. Edward started. Reserved? Am I reserved, Marianne? Yes, very. I do not understand you, replied he, coloring. Reserved? How? In what manner? What am I to tell you? What can you suppose? Eleanor looked surprised at his emotion, but trying to laugh off the subject, she said to him, Do not you know my sister well enough to understand what she means? Do not you know she calls everyone reserved who does not talk as fast and admire what she admires as rapturously as herself? Edward made no answer. His gravity and thoughtfulness returned on him in their fullest extent, and he sat for some time, silent and dull.